Well, welcome to everybody, and it's lovely to see everybody, and thank you very much for participating in this lecture. This is Linlithgow Civic Trust's annual lecture, and we're delighted to have Bruce Jamieson with us to talk to us. He's always a good person to have, very informative, very entertaining. And so we love having him along with us, and are grateful to you, Bruce, for giving up your time and coming to speak to us. You will all probably know Bruce because he's been around quite a wee while, shall we say. I know you started off in life with a master's degree in history from Edinburgh, and of course you also taught for quite a while at Linlithgow Academy. And so are well known to families and to children who attended Linlithgow Academy. And since then, you've been writing and researching and finding lots of interesting things, especially about Linlithgow, that most of us didn't know anything at all about. So it's always fascinating to listen to you, Bruce. You're the author, as we know, of several history books. And have you written a book about this?
No, there is a chapter coming out in my next book.
Okay. So we'll look forward to that. So I'm going to hand over to Bruce to entertain us. We will have some questions at the end if any of you particularly wish to ask questions of Bruce. So Bruce, it is over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for inviting me into your living rooms this evening. That's very kind. And I'm going to start with a historical term that I would imagine one or two of you have forgotten, and that term is a holiday cruise. Some of you may remember what a holiday is and what a cruise is, and that's where I'm going to start. So in the year 2011, I had the good fortune to be on board the Cunard ship Queen Victoria as it sailed through the Panama Canal, and as seen here, into Lake Gatun. It was an unforgettable experience, indeed a somewhat surreal one. As we passed through the vast impenetrable jungle and rainforest all around us, I could see around me people supping drinks, swimming in the pool or sunbathing. I was much more fascinated by the unfolding scenes before me, for I had studied the history of the Scots trading entrepot in this very area. And now I could see the place for myself. Capuchin monkeys swung and chattered through the trees. Unbelievably coloured birds flitted in the canopy, and below us in the water and on the banks of the man-made lake were hordes of crocodiles swimming, looking up hopefully at the passengers on the ship, or basking in the blazing sunshine. It was well over 30 degrees Celsius. It was certainly not Black Ness. I was fascinated and somewhat disbelieving. How could any right-minded entrepreneurs ever have contemplated building townships in this area and establishing in the scorpion and snake-infested jungle an international trading hub? But that is just what was proposed in Scotland in the 1690s. What on earth possessed them? Desperation, perhaps, for the late 17th century was a dreadful period for Scotland. Most people lived off the land and agriculture was inefficient and wasteful. Few farmers lived much above subsistence level, and a threefold return on crop planting was the norm, providing just enough to pay in rent, keep in store for the next season's sowing, and feed the family. As the old Scots saying went, "Ane to saw, ane to gnaw, and ane to pie the laird withal." Rundrig farming was the traditional method of treating the available arable soil. Land was parcelled out in strips, measuring a chain wide, 22 yards, by a furlong, 220 yards in length, the area over which an ox plough could comfortably operate. Rigs were reallocated annually, so the incentive to improve one's allotted land was non-existent. No one was willing to experiment with drainage, fertilizers, or any modern methods, as the cotter would not get the benefit of his labours. Experimental techniques could fail, and failure meant famine. It was a precarious existence, and if anything went wrong, it spelt disaster, and that's just what happened. The last decade of the 17th century was the coldest for 750 years. A mini ice age descended on much of northern Europe, and this saw already poor farming practices badly affected. Recently, dendrochronology, that is, using dating evidence from tree rings, has shown the extent of this climate change. Everywhere, poor harvests meant that famine stalked the land. Documents reveal the scale of this problem in Linlithgow, where hunger gripped the townsfolk. A St. Michael's Kirk Session minute records the phrase, "the sad and deplorable condition of the town." It is recorded that some individuals were reduced to eating grass, nettles, and rotten meat in order to survive. Babies were left on the steps of the borough halls in the hope that the magistrates would find someone willing to feed them. There is evidence of one local, Gabriel Mowbray, killing his youngest daughter and hiding the body so that there would be one less mouth to feed. Population figures from the time are sketchy, but it would appear as if, on average, some 10 to 15% of the population perished from starvation. With just brief periods of respite, the Scottish harvest failed from 1695 to 1699. But to those living at the time, it seemed longer, and arguing that it must be a punishment from God, the period was christened the 7 ill years, after the time of famine in Egypt mentioned in the book of Genesis. The old poor law, administered by St. Michael's Kirk Session, tried to help, but funds were low, and strict conditions surrounded any grant. Money itself was very rarely distributed. Instead, help was normally given out in the form of oatmeal, clothing, sometimes coal. Hundreds of hungry vagrants roamed the countryside, and if they were caught begging in the borough, they were arrested. If they ignored an earlier warning, they were branded with the red-hot iron you see here, bearing the emblem of the Black Bitch. And afterwards, they were exiled from the town. A great number wandered towards Edinburgh, sleeping rough, begging and stealing on the way. Many ended up in the refuge centre set up in Greyfriars churchyard, and those that died were buried in anonymous pauper pits. To tackle this desperate economic situation, in 1695, the Scottish Parliament passed acts allowing the consolidation of run rigs into bigger fields and the better use of common land. But such was the backward state of Scottish farming that it was decades before any real improvement can be seen. This is the earliest known local estate plan, showing the land ownership of the Earl of Dalhousie in the very early 19th century. And although the enclosure movement has created some larger fields, strip farming can still be seen. On the right, particularly in an area of poor soil where Clarendon is now, appropriately named Bearshanks. The Scottish government also encouraged the creation of the Bank of Scotland in an attempt to accrue capital for investment. Its first chief accountant was George Watson, the founder of the eponymous school. He is now buried somewhere in Greyfriars churchyard, nobody knows where. The authorities also issued a charter to raise capital through public subscription to float the Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies. Its Latin motto, top left, translating as, "Wherever the world extends, united strength is stronger." And it was this company which inaugurated the scheme to build a trading colony on the Isthmus of Darien. In Panama, where I was cruising 10 years ago through the late 19th century canal, the existence of which shows that there was some sense in the Scottish project. To travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, ships had to make the hazardous trip round Cape Horn on the southern tip of South America, adding months to the journey sometimes, and because of frequent stormy conditions involving a high chance of being lost at sea. If a colony could be established at Darien, goods could be ferried from the Atlantic across the isthmus and loaded onto ships on the Pacific side, speeding up trade and making it much more reliable, especially to places such as India and the Orient. And Scotland was desperate desperate to improve its trading position and boost its economy. The nation's range of trading goods was very small. It exported linen, woolen products, timber, coal, some of it loaded onto berthed ships at Blackness and delivered to the Low Countries or the Baltic ports. A group of Scottish merchants started talking about setting up a trading empire, and they held a conference chaired by Provost Alexander Milne of Linlithgow, who wrote in the minutes of that meeting that, quote, an overseas colony would be a great ease to the country and indeed void it of many dissenting persons, strong but idle beggars, Egyptians, and common and notorious whores, who could all be made useful in the colonies. So an ulterior motive there, perhaps. But Scotland did need new trade routes, especially as it faced massive competition from its much more affluent neighbour, England, whose navigation acts restricted Scottish trade. Furthermore, the directors of the powerful East India Company were keen to keep their monopoly over trade. And it was those influential gentlemen who put pressure on possible investors in England, Holland, and Hamburg, and forced them not to get involved in the new Scots venture. The king, himself, of course, a Dutchman, received payment from the East India Company in return for his granting them a monopoly of trade, and he was extremely reluctant to back the Scottish enterprise. He was also at war with France and therefore unwilling to additionally antagonize Spain, who claimed the territory where it was thought the Scots were interested in. Consequently, the Scots had no alternative but to finance the expedition themselves, perhaps egged on further by a desire to cock a snoot at the opposing English interests. It became a national patriotic duty to subscribe, and there was no shortage of takers, as hundreds of ordinary Scots folk invested money in the expedition. Linlithgow subscribers included merchant Adam Buckney, who shipped out of Blackness, where he also operated the tavern Lucky Buckney's, a forerunner of the Blackness Inn and now the Lobster Pot, perhaps. Buckney took out £100 in shares, while the richer members of society, such as the Duke of Queensberry, invested £3,000, as can be seen here at the top of this extract from the list of 1,500 subscribers. Buckney was joined by other Linlithgow merchants, anxious to cash in on new trading opportunities. They included John Bairdy, John Curry, Andrew Burnett, past Provost Robert Turnbull, and James Smith, all of whom put in their £100, as shown here with the receipts issued to Smith. From its Blackness meeting place, the Linlithgow Gildry, the mercantile committee representing Linlithgow's trades, sent out a notification to the town's tanners, bakers, fleshers, weavers, tailors, and shoemakers that they had pledged £300 of their monies towards the great cause. The town's first citizen was equally enthusiastic, and both Provost Alexander Masterton and his son Thomas contributed £100 each. Another son, also called Alexander after his father, went even further and volunteered to travel on board one of the ships heading off on the expedition. The Linlithgow Town Council put in an additional £200, and all in all, it's reckoned that one-half of the entire wealth of the nation went into the project, approximately £500,000, equivalent to around £60 million today. Fervent pride nationally was aroused, and it continued as a large crowd cheered to the echo in July 1698, when 5 ships, St Andrew, Unicorn, Dolphin, Endeavour, and Caledonia, all set sail from Leith docks. The last named, the Caledonia, was a 56-gun Indiaman, especially built for the expedition in Lubeck, a Germanic port with which ships from Blackness regularly traded. Thousands had volunteered to take part: discharged soldiers, poverty-stricken Highlanders, adventurers in the hope of a new life in a new land, wherever that would be, as no one had any idea of where the ships were headed. It was kept secret. Scores of stowaways who had hoped to go along had to be ejected tearfully from the ships before sailing, and they joined the huge crowd gathered on the quay to see the ships off to sea. The vessels proudly bore two flags, the Scottish saltire and a specially commissioned pennant bearing the rising sun, a symbol of dawning hope and new beginnings for Scotland's trading success, a hope carried by all the 1,200 volunteers on board. Although the company still bore the names Africa and the Indies, it was actually to Central America that the 5 small ships were headed, although only 2 participants knew of that destination. Secret orders were not to be opened by the ship's captains until the vessels reached Madeira, when opening the sealed envelopes would reveal where they were going. And the fleet duly docked at Funchal, of course in Madeira, a Portuguese colony, where the sealed envelopes were opened and the fleet's destination revealed. 4 crew members who had died of what was called the flux were buried on the island. After trading for basic provisions and for the wine for which the island was famous, too much wine, it has to be said, I'm afraid, the 17th century ships continued on their voyage, leaving the same harbour from which another cruise ship that I once was on sailed in 2018. It was the Magellan, the smaller of the 2 in the aerial view, now as a result of the demise of the cruise maritime company being broken up in Oman. But I digress. Back to 320 years ago, the Pioneer's small fleet crossed the Atlantic without incident and made landfall on a tiny island, 20 miles long by 4 miles wide, just off the larger island of Puerto Rico. It's now called Vieques and is famous for its rum. The Scots, however, called it Crab Island and claimed it as a Scottish colony, a very short-lived one, as within months a Danish ship arrived and claimed it for Denmark. The only 2 men who had actually known in advance where they were headed were the leader of the expedition, Captain Robert Pennycook, and the inspiration behind the whole plan, William Patterson, a Scot who had made his name down south as one of the founding directors of the Bank of England. Patterson had returned to Edinburgh with the audacious scheme on which he had set his heart, ever since he had spoken to a sailor called Lionel Wafer, a Welsh buccaneer, who had told him about a wonderful paradise on the Isthmus of Panama, a sheltered bay, friendly Indians, obliging women, rich fertile land, and a situation rich in trading potential, a place called Darien. And it was indeed off the shores of that narrow strip of land that Scotland's small armada eventually weighed anchor. The ships which undertook that 3-month voyage were tiny by today's standards. The Caledonia, the largest in the fleet, probably measured something like 50 metres, 160 feet from bow to stern. I was on board a 300-metre long cruise ship, and as it exited Gatton Lake and entered Limon Bay, I mentally tried to picture the Scotch ships dropping anchor near that very spot on November 2nd, 1698. Over 70 pioneers had died on the 4-month voyage, including William Patterson's wife, child, and maid. Many more were to perish in a land which bore little resemblance to the glowing description which Patterson had listened to. Many of the settlers, men and some women, were already malnourished and sick. Supplies were low, and the thick jungle offered little in the way of sustenance. The place was rife with sandflies and mosquitoes, and malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery were endemic. But making the most of the situation and taking advantage of a relatively cool season, temperatures rarely above 24°C, and when rainfall was minimal, the Scots set about building shacks for their main base, which they called New Edinburgh, in a land they called Caledonia. They soon found that the land was unsuitable for farming, and it worsened when the spring brought torrential rain and the death count rose. It included Alexander Masterton, Linlithgow's provost son. He had been a seasoned mariner, having sailed on his father's merchant ships from Blackness Harbour to several ports in the Low Countries and on the Baltic. On the Darien expedition, sailing in the Caledonia, he had held the rank of boatswain's yeoman, the senior crewman of the deck, responsible for the ship's rigging, anchors, cables, and sails. And now he was gone, perished along with 400 others. His father and his mother, she was Margaret Glenn, the daughter of James Glenn, another Linlithgow provost, they did not hear of his death until months later. The remainder of the settlers were starving and racked with fevers. The yams and maize they had planted failed due to the tropical conditions. Plans to trade with the indigenous population in exchange for food fell through when the locals were shown what commodities the Scots had brought with them. Cargo manifests, still kept in the Scottish Records Office, revealed the contents of the ship's holds. Thousands of combs and mirrors, boxes of wigs made from human hair, men and women's slippers and gloves, bundles of woolen blankets, buttons, flat irons, stacks of balaclava-like woolen headgear, clay pipes, and Bibles, obviously intended for use in the conversion of the natives to Christianity. Ignorance of the chosen site was laid bare. The trading goods could be a list of things that semi-clad Aborigines in a tropical jungle do not need. Quarrels broke out among the elected councillors, and schisms occurred among the would-be colonists, including a group of Gaelic-speaking Highlanders who tended to disassociate themselves from the rest of the settlers and group together in argumentative coteries. To make matters worse, the ships sent out to trade for supplies returned with news that all English ships and colonies had received a signed and sealed order from King William forbidding them to trade with the Scots. One ship did not return at all from the mission, as the Dolphin was captured by the Spanish and its crew imprisoned. The mood of one Scottish colonist can be actually determined, as a memoir has survived, written by Roger Oswald, a young gentleman who had joined the venture full of hope and optimism, but amidst the reality of the situation, he found his feelings had changed. He later wrote, "We lived on less than a pound of mouldy flour a week, boiled with a little water. Maggots and worms had to be skimmed off the top before we ate." And he went on, "Yet every man daily tried to turn out to work with a hatchet, pickaxe, or sickle. My shoulders were so worn with carrying burdens that the skin came off and left them full of boils. If a man were sick and obliged to stay inside, no victuals were allocated to him that day. The women too complained of their hard labours. Our councillors all the while lay at their ease, sometimes divided into factions and swayed by particular interests. They were useless." The final straw was news that the Spanish, who claimed the area, were planning an attack on the colony. The settlers had no choice but to abandon the scheme, and in July 1699, in temperatures around 30 degrees Celsius, they took to the sea in panic, abandoning the settlement and heading out of the Bay of Caledonia. Of the 4 ships that fled the colony, only the Caledonia made it back to Scotland, with fewer than 300 souls on board. In the months, however, before the ships returned home, back in Scotland, the only news that had been heard from the colony had arrived on a turtle hunting ship, which had called into Darien in the very early days of the expedition. The news it carried was, of course, full of hope. The settlers had arrived. They had met with the native population. They were beginning to farm. That initial report reached Edinburgh in March 1699, and all over Scotland there was rejoicing and pride at the news of the colonists' safe arrival, of the Indians' warm welcome and the verdant beauty of the country. However, at the very moment the bells were ringing in St. Giles and in St. Michael's, and prayers of thanksgiving were being offered in the churches, the Scottish colonists were facing disaster. But bolstered by the early news and ignorant of the true situation, 2 more ships set off to join the colonists, the oddly named Hopeful Binning of Bo'ness and the Olive Branch, captained respectively by Alexander Stark and William Jamieson. They left in May 1699, and 3 months later, when they eventually arrived in Panama, they found New Edinburgh totally deserted and desolate. A week after their arrival, a careless accident by a steward intent on fetching a nighttime brandy set fire to the Olive Branch, burning all the supplies within. Facing starvation, only 12 Scots elected to stay in Darien, while the rest boarded the Bo'ness registered ship and sailed to Jamaica, where most of the crew died. Amongst those still buried on the island is John Dalgleish, son of the minister of St. Michael's, the Reverend Alexander. The father, Alexander, had recently been selected after serving for some years in Abercorn Church. John was also a preacher and had volunteered to act as a chaplain to the expedition. And so, not knowing the true situation, another expedition had already set sail. In September 1699, 4 ships left from the Clyde, packed with over 1,200 men and a few women, having been delayed a whole month by unfavourable winds. Meanwhile, another ship was beating its way in the opposite direction, eastwards across the Atlantic, bearing the news of the Darien scheme's disaster. It finally reached Bristol, and a coach rumbled up the Great North Road to Scotland with the grim details, but the news arrived too late. By the time it reached Glasgow, the 4 ships had already left for Darien. They were the Rising Sun, the Company's Hope, the Duke of Hamilton, and the Hope of Bo'ness, captained by Richard Dalling. The Rising Sun was the first to reach Caledonia Bay on November 30th, 1699, and the crew was shocked to find New Edinburgh deserted. Other ships followed at a cost, for altogether during the voyage, 160 people had already perished aboard them. The Scots had arrived expecting a thriving settlement. Instead, they had to start repairing the dilapidated huts and forage for food, as the month's delay in setting off from Scotland had badly depleted their stores. Hungry and disappointed, things went from bad to worse, and more squabbling occurred between various groups. Local tribesmen alerted the Scots that a Spanish army was proceeding towards them, and this added to their misfortunes. 2 days later, Captain Alexander Campbell and Lieutenant Turnbull, with 200 Scots and 40 Indians, clashed with the Spaniards and defeated them, although the skirmish killed 7 Scots and left Campbell, Turnbull, and Indian chief Pedro wounded. The Caledonians, though, were elated over their successful encounter, but their joy proved to be short-lived, for this was only the start. A few days later, 11 Spanish men-of-war anchored in Caledonia Bay in plain view of the settlement. The Spaniards disembarked and advanced their line of battle close to the Scottish fort of St. Andrew. They also captured small streams where the colonists got their drinking water and laid siege to the beleaguered Scots. After a month, there was no option but to surrender. However, the defeated adventurers were given 14 days to leave and were allowed to do so with heads held high, still in possession of their weapons, with colours flying and drums beating. And so, in the early morning of April 11th, 1700, the 60-gun ship Rising Sun was helped by a Spanish warship out of a wind-locked Caledonia Bay, past what is now a village lived in by a group from the Kuna tribe, and out into the Atlantic, just as I had done on the Queen Victoria over 300 years later. Back in 1700, 3 other Scottish vessels sailed away from Panama, heading for Jamaica. Unfortunately, all 4 vessels met with disaster. The Hope of Bowness leaked so badly, it had to be sold to the Spanish in Cartagena in Colombia. The company's Hope was wrecked on rocks off the west end of Cuba. The Rising Sun did reach the West Indies and then struggled on to Charleston in South Carolina, where it dropped anchor on a sandbar. 2 weeks later, the ship was blasted by a dreadful hurricane and went down with all hands. 112 people and its captain, James Gibson. The ship, the Duke of Hamilton, also went down in the same storm, but its crew was saved, as most of them were on shore. Of the 1,200 original settlers who had set out on that second expedition, only 300 made it back to Scotland, where some received the Darien Medal for their bravery against the Spanish, shown here in the lower centre. The wreck of the Scottish dream of a colony in Panama carried a heavy toll, for the cost was horrendous. In human terms, it accounted for the loss of nearly 2,000 souls. From the 14 ships that had sailed from Scotland, 11 never returned home. In economic terms, the company's books, kept in this chest, now in the Museum of Scotland, revealed a national loss of over half the nation's wealth. William Patterson found himself forced to defend his actions, and he seems to have satisfied his interrogators with a no-holds-barred account of the colony. Some years later, he was granted a pension, but he died a sad and deeply disillusioned man. The directors of the company met, and a variety of blame for the scheme's failure was bandied about. Incidentally, the cigarette card shown on the right, showing the directors of the company, was issued by Mitchell's Tobacco Company, which began life in Linlithgow. But 2 Linlithgow men were in no doubt where the blame lay. The company had lost the life savings of Alexander Masterton and Robert Turnbull, who were left with an abiding hatred of England, which they accused of scuppering Scotland's economic future and sabotaging the nation's chance of financial independence. Along with other influential Linlithgow merchants, they bitterly opposed any dealings with their larger neighbour. And Darien Company Director Lord Belhaven agreed, complaining bitterly about the inhumanity and barbarity of England, blocking trade and denying succour to dying Scottish settlers. Many others who agreed with this sentiment petitioned the Scots Parliament with their groans and lamentable complaints, seen here on the left. A diplomatic war broke out between the Scots and the English governments, culminating in the English Aliens Act of 1705, seen on the right. It stated that all Scottish nationals in England were to be treated as foreigners, and that all estates held in England by Scots would be treated as alien property, making inheritance extremely uncertain. It also included an embargo on the Scottish imports of Scottish products into England and the English colonies, constituting half of Scotland's trade. The export of arms, ammunition and horses into Scotland was forbidden, so that Scots could not raise an army and invade England. It became clear to influential Scots that a bankrupt Scotland was economically incapable of going it alone. And just 7 years after the failure at Darien, an act of union joining Scotland with England as the junior partner in the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The French illustration on the left depicts the opening of the last ever Scottish Parliament for 292 years. And on the right, some suggested designs for a new united flag. Linlithgow Provost Robert Turnbull protested mightily against any such union of parliaments, as indeed did every civic head in Scotland and the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. With his merchant hat on, Turnbull saw little benefit accruing from the new parliamentary union and remained constantly opposed to it, arguing with whoever would listen that the deal was going through on account of, quote, favours, sinecures, pensions, offices and jobbery. He meant, of course, using privileged status to achieve private gain. Turnbull also railed against the allocation of seats in the Westminster Parliament, 513 to England and 45 to Scotland, just one more than Cornwall. And this, of course, was allocated by the relative wealth of each nation. The 1707 Linlithgow marches took place shortly after the Act of Union was signed on May the 1st, and feelings in Linlithgow were obviously still running high. It was reported that the riding took place, quote, in solemn fashion with much tension and uncertainty in the air, leading eventually to a tumult between the smiths and the tailors over remarks made concerning the loss of our own parliament. As part of the deal, England paid off Scotland's debts with the equivalent, a sum of £398,085 and 10 shillings, most of which went to cover the losses sustained in the Darien venture. The lower right document is a claim made to the institution established to administer this money, an organisation which eventually became the Royal Bank of Scotland. The Duke of Queensberry, who led the case for union, received considerable compensation and high offices in the United Kingdom, and he's seen here presenting the Act to Queen Anne. And what of Darien? There have been a few expeditions back to see if any traces remain of the Scots venture. Very little has been found, as the jungle has largely reclaimed the whole area. A group from Bristol University found little other than the ditch dug around Fort St Andrews, seen in the bottom left, and now flooded by the sea. The fort itself is totally eaten away by termites and the weather. They also found that the locals, members of the Kuna tribe, still have an oral history of when the Scots came. Occasionally, the native tribesmen come across the bones of the many Scots who still lie amidst the tropical foliage. A pair of amateur archaeologists, ex-Pats Stuart Redwood and Don Taylor of the St Andrews Society of Panama, visited the site in 1998, the 300th anniversary of the Scots fleet entering Caledonia Bay. They picked up some 17th century coins, some musket balls, rusted tools, and a sundial, scant tribute to the ill-fated scheme. But imagine if it had succeeded, perhaps actually aided by the English, who wished to reduce Spanish influence in the area. Scotland would have had a valuable trading colony and owned the land through which the Panama Canal was later constructed. It might have been the making of a financially secure, independent Scottish nation, or maybe not. Instead, Scotland gave up its independent parliament, and until July the 1st, 1999, our nation sent its members to the Parliament in Westminster. Whatever side of the nationalist debate you are on, it must surely be agreed that the Darien disaster has a lot to answer for. Thank you.
Thank you. That's just great, Bruce. Thank you very much. I wonder if this, yes, can we all clap? Thank you. I was wondering if you could manage to do that. That's brilliant. I wonder if there's any lessons that we should be learning. There probably are loads. It almost seems as if it had a curse on it, that expedition. I mean, it was just so horrific. One disaster and tragedy after another.
It was pretty awful, and I was hoping nobody was coming along for a cheerful night out.
No, good. Okay.
I was just thinking at the inception of the idea, that Patterson brought it about. I know, but there just seemed to be a groundswell of support from everybody across the country. Putting money into. Was this just? How did they get that across? That optimism? How did they get that PR to get so many people involved in it?
I think given the background of economic disaster and starvation, they were desperate to get out of that. And I think when England put the foot down and said, we're not having anything to do with it, it then became a patriotic national crusade that everybody... The publicity was interesting. They did circulate pamphlets and leaflets. I know Linlithgow town crier was ordered to walk along the high street, oh yay, subscribe to the company trading to Darien. So the methods of communication at the time were well used.
Bruce, as an economic historian, I've always found the politics of that period too complicated. But I mean, what was the relationship between the Scottish Parliament and King William? It's as if he was almost kind of, I mean, he was the de facto king of Scotland as well as England, but he seemed to be kind of washing his hands of the country.
Yeah, but
remember
the background of Scottish relationship with previous kings, you know, with Charles I, Charles II, that there was a lot of ill will there originally. And I think the Scottish Church was also very influential, and they were always a bit concerned about where the king's religious motives lay. I think that's why the Church of Scotland was so against the Act of Union. They were terribly worried that the Scottish Church would not be allowed to continue in the way it wanted. William III, of course, was dead by the time the Act of Union was signed. It was by then Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, that actually had to sign the Act of Union. I like the story that the bells of St. Giles told. They rang joyfully when the news of Darien first came, but they told, and everybody in Edinburgh knew what they were playing. They were playing a well-known Scottish ditty of the time, "Why am I sad on my wedding day?"
Can I ask, what intrigues me is, now with a project, you would do huge amounts of research. The things seem to be based, if I heard you correctly, Bruce, on very limited basis in fact. It was almost based on information that the chap had heard from somebody else. Did I pick that up correctly? Or
I think you're right. I think you're right. A lot of ignorance involved. But remember, it was 4 months failing to get there and 4 months back. And very few had visited that area before. I think Patterson was just carried away with the idea we must get Scotland trading, and desperate to cling to any kind of story which he thought would lead to a trading empire that would make Scotland rich. But you're right. I mean, look at the list of things they took with them.
Yeah.
Balaclavas, blankets, Bibles, and buttons. I can't imagine the Cunard tribe queuing up, and the idea of them all running about with gloves and slippers and balaclava helmet through the jungle of Central America.
Just to finish, I was kind of hoping when you said that there was still some evidence of them remembering people that were all partying with balaclavas out in that area today, but obviously that hasn't happened. Thank you.
I don't know if that's in the story, but they have these storytellers, griots. If you remember the Roots, the program or the book Roots, the story of Kunta Kinte being kidnapped in an African jungle was carried on for generations. And that's what's happened in Central America. This Kuna tribe still talk, and they have these elders that give you the history of the tribe. And the Scots' arrival features in that narrative.
I wanted to ask whether, what was the effect on Linlithgow? Do you know much about that? And did they ever get any money back?
Sybil, I'm terrified when I get asked questions by historians.
I enjoyed your talk very much.
I mentioned the Marches Day of 1707, where, and of course it's difficult to find records. Not many people kept diaries and records at that time. But as the town council were against it, as the provost was against the Act of Union, I would imagine that things rankled. And to be honest, if you look at economics history of the time, Scotland really didn't prosper from the Act of Union until well into the 18th century. Not until about 1780 did they really begin to see benefits, and were then able to trade, of course, with English colonies, which had been forbidden before.
Bruce, that was absolutely fascinating. I noticed that one of the ships was called the Duke of Hamilton, and having an interest in Kinneil House in Bowness and the Hamilton estates in Bowness, I was wondering, was the Duke of Hamilton an influential promoter of the scheme?
I haven't a clue. I don't know. I was amazed at how much Bowness was involved, but because 3 of the ships were Bowness registered, the Hope of Bowness and the Hopeful Bidding of Bowness, an awful lot of hope involved. What the Duke of Hamilton, I would imagine he would have been, I'll need to look up, you can see the list of subscribers and find out which members of the aristocracy subscribed to the cause. I'd be surprised if he wasn't there. I would have thought he would have put money into the scheme, but maybe somebody listening knows better than I, but I didn't have a chance to look at all 1,500 subscribers.
little bit more research for you to do, Ian.
Well, thank
Indeed.
you. I was amazed at how much there was local input. You know, Linlithgow and Bo'ness. Of course, I cherry-picked as much information as I could locally, but there was a great involvement from this neck of the woods.
Okay, any more hands? No? Okay, I think we'll bring it to a close. And if, once again, I can thank Bruce, and I think our Chair of Linlithgow Borough Trust and Secretary of Linlithgow Civic Trust, John, has already given you our little thank you gift for just showing our appreciation.
Indeed, I think I shall probably sample it in a very few minutes' time.
I think you deserve it. So it's been lovely having you. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.
And it didn't last too long.
Excellent. Very good.